Good morning and welcome to the latest installment of the National Security Space Association's Space-Time Interview Series. My name is Chris Williams and I'm honored to serve as the chair of NSSA's Studies and Analysis Center. We're delighted to have you with us today. Ms. Joyce Corell. Joyce, thank you for being here. We are just thrilled to have you here. Let me read Joyce's bio for you. Joyce is the Assistant Director, Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate in the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Joyce, prior to this posting, she was the Assistant Director for the Strategic Capabilities Directorate of the Office of National Counterintelligence Executive. Ms. Corell also served at the National Security Agency, or NSA, for 23 years. She spent a significant portion of her career focused on various aspects of defensive and offensive computer network operations, from capability development to the development of national policy and legislation. Complementing these roles, Ms. Corell also led various activities establishing and nurturing partnerships with the private sector, ranging from technology transfer, export licensing, and the development of strategic alliances, both domestic and international. Truly distinguished individual with a tremendous background, and thank you, Joyce, again for being here. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of those who participated in Tuesday's second annual Classified Space Threats Conference. This online event, sponsored by NSSA and featuring TSSCI level presentations on foreign space and counterspace threats from senior officials at DIA and NASIC, was highly informative and very well attended. We will soon announce additional classified online events, and we strongly welcome your participation in those exciting events. Now back to today's event. Some brief background. We all know that supply chain security and cybersecurity efforts are increasingly important. As noted in a recent NSA report, the U.S. defense industrial base encompasses more than 100,000 companies that produce all the systems and services upon which DoD and the nation rely to underpin U.S. national security. These companies range from prime contractors with hundreds of thousands of employees to small businesses with just a handful of employees. While they're an attractive target for foreign intelligence services interested in stealing research and development or learning how to compromise weapons and space platforms, these entities vary widely in the resources they invest in cybersecurity. This has left the defense industrial base, or DIB, extremely vulnerable to cyber intrusion and intellectual property theft, and cyber adversaries, including China, Russia, and Iran, have actively infiltrated the DIB for years. The threats to the DIB are some of the most sophisticated the nation faces, end quote. This ever-increasing threat demands an equally aggressive and vigilant response. Our speaker today has been on the front lines of this fight for many, many years. In her opening remarks, Joyce will discuss the role of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, or NCSC, and the work of the Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate, which she so ably leads, as well as important efforts to help educate American companies both on emerging cyber and supply chain threats, and encourage adoption of proven best practices to counter such attacks and secure our critical networks and systems. Today we'll follow our standard format. Our esteemed speaker will provide some opening remarks, followed by a question and answer session. Our discussion will end at approximately noon. I would remind members of the audience that you can propose questions for the speaker by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I may not be able to get to all of your questions, but I'll do my best. With that, again, Joyce, so glad you could join us today. Thanks for taking the time from your busy schedule, and thank you for your tireless service to our nation. The floor is yours.
Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm very appreciative of this particular venue for the attention paid to this particular topic. As Chris mentioned, I've been in this mission space, supply chain security for quite some time. So let me speak a little bit about my organization. The NCSC, the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, is housed in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So while, like many other intelligence organizations, we look at being able to provide a warning function and warn the government organizations, the private sector companies, and the public about threats, we also, in counterintelligence, have a responsibility to think about response actions to actually counter actions and risks that we face from an adversary. Our responsibilities in CSC are actually government-wide. If you've had a chance to read the National Counterintelligence Strategies signed by the President in January of last year, that particular strategy highlights a number of areas that are of keen interest to us at this time. Historically, from a counterintelligence perspective, when we thought about the counterintelligence space, we thought about adversaries, and we focused our attention on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, key areas of focus. But in the last several years, we have seen our adversaries evolving the ways in which they try to interject and come into our country. Most recently, there was a lot of attention focused on election security. We have concerns regarding not just malign interference with elections, but a whole host of issues relating to trust and confidence in our democratic principles. So the strategy that was signed out by President Trump in January last year actually focuses on 5 key areas that are now viewed as the areas in which an adversary conducts its operations. Not in any kind of priority order. I'll describe those briefly because they're very germane to our conversation this morning. So, threats to critical infrastructure, threats to the U.S. supply chain, or how we source things in our country, threats to economic security. We've seen over the past several years, the consequences of theft of intellectual property. Economic security is on a par with national security in today's day and age. Malign influence, we're worried about what adversaries do with the vast theft of personally identifiable information and how adversaries are operating to influence and shape public opinion. And finally, the fifth area of interest is cybersecurity and how the adversary might operate using in the cyber domain and using technical skills. And I think the SolarWinds compromise is a clear example of how interrelated all of these different pillars are, where in SolarWinds we see that the software supply chain has been exploited with the adversary using cyber technical means at their disposal. So that's sort of an evolving landscape that we face as a nation. So I want to talk now a little bit about how we're focused in CSC to raise awareness, across the entire government, across the nation, with the public and with the private sector, to raise awareness about what the adversary is doing to the best that we can in an unclassified environment. Many of you probably have clearances and are well aware of how uptight we might get when it comes to speaking about topics in an unclassified environment like this one. So it's very important that we have these types of opportunities to connect with you. I want to talk a little bit now about supply chain risk management and where the government is at, and what we think, how we think people should begin focusing at an enterprise level on how to manage risk. A key point that might seem self-evident but bears covering is the fact that when one thinks about risk management, this is a team sport. And from a supply chain perspective, you need to bring together on your team your experts who are contract and acquisition professionals, your IT professionals, your CIOs, your people who manage your data, your chief information security officers who look at information, the risks to protecting information. So it's not security is part of this discipline. This emerging discipline of supply chain risk management. And it's not just, guns, gates, and guards folks, but it's really everyone who needs to come together to figure out when an organization, whether it's a government organization or a private sector firm, is sourcing from a third party, are you making your decisions with as fulsome amount of information to inform your decision analysis as possible? So that's sort of the first point is, team sport. And I will say as well, to share with you what I have learned in this particular domain. It's not just a team sport with people from different lines of business. It's also a team sport with attorneys that support us, because we need attorneys who have expertise in contract law, who have expertise in where I work in the intelligence community and intelligence activities or defense activities. We need attorneys that have expertise in trade law. When we source things and we think about supply chain risk management, we source things from all over the world. So trade law, intellectual property protection. So a variety of legal disciplines also come to bear on our decision analysis and how we manage risk and how we share information. So it's a team sport with attorneys as well. I want to shift a little bit now and talk about how does one best understand third-party risk. Probably about 5 years ago, there were companies that provided information, who are like data aggregators, who provide information for the business community, for Wall Street, to inform joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions. You had companies, like Bloomberg, Dow Jones, Pricewaterhouse, Deloitte, all the big accounting firms do robust due diligence for their clients. But in the last couple of years, we've actually seen a maturation and an emergence of a number of different firms that are now in the business of robust commercial due diligence. And this data gathering from these types of firms has evolved from just providing information on business financials to now including information on business operations like cybersecurity. So that's a very positive thing. And that is using robust commercial due diligence tools is really the point of departure for understanding third-party risk from when you think about with whom do you source your supplies. One topic in conversations like this about third-party risk, conversation I've had with many individuals in the private sector as well as other government organizations, is having a conversation on how organizations think about sort of the left-right boundaries of risk. So when you're thinking about doing business with a third party, what are the pieces of information or what's the facts at your disposal that would cause you to say, I don't want to do business with this company. I've seen enough things happening that this company is now one I will not do business with. So that's one level. The other, then a number of companies are ones where you'll do business with the company, but things happen. The business environment is dynamic. Companies are launched, and the companies change. On a daily, monthly basis. Business units get spun off into limited liability corporations. So in a dynamic environment, you say, yes, I will do business with this company, but, and the but leads you to, some types of constraints that you might put in contract language or legal negotiations at the point of actually going into a business relationship. So that's sort of the middle ground. So the other end is if you know who you don't want to do business with, but you don't have any alternative because that entity has such a large market presence, or they're the only ones that make the special widget that is exactly what you need, well then how do you think about alternate sources of supply, and how do you look to the innovation ecosystem, which includes incentives to be able to nurture an environment that will then produce these alternate sources of supply that will be more trustworthy. So that with those those kind of three elements, no, I'm not going to do business with you. Yes, I will, but with certain conditions and caveats. And then creating something new. How do we think about what does no and yes mean? Within the government, we've begun to have these types of conversations about what means no. the Pathfinder topic from several years ago was the federal government's examination of Kaspersky Labs and the decision that using this type of technology from a company, antivirus technology, where the service provider of AV technology has a very intimate access to your network. In the case of the federal government, that level of access and the fact that the process was to remove malware from systems, data would be sent then to Kaspersky headquarters in Russia, in a country where there is an authoritarian regime and there's no actual due process. There would be no ability for the company to say no to the Russian government if the Russian government leaned on that firm to say, take these actions on our behalf. Those factors, brought together, led the government to say that using this technology posed an unmitigatable risk. Therefore, the government would prohibit the use of this technology on any federal systems. So that was within the ability of the government to make that decision and enforce that decision. There was subsequent litigation. So the issue played out in the courts. And the final decision was that the executive branch has a right to make decisions about national security and about what the government uses on its systems, and that the Congress has the right to tell the federal government how to, manage the work that we do as, custodians of taxpayer dollars. So that informed how the government is moving forward on making decisions about excluding or removing a particular vendor from our systems, or the products from a particular vendor. And that particular example illustrates that policy is being shaped not just by policymakers in the executive branch or members of Congress. Policy is also being shaped by our judicial branch. So all branches of government are in the game now. So since that time, since that decision, things have evolved to a point now where the government has the authorities through the issuance of the Secure Technology Act for all government agencies to manage supply chain risk and to have the authorities to make these types of decisions. This is an emerging discipline, and there have been numerous actions taken through the focusing on the energy sector, focusing on telecommunications sector, to begin to try to strengthen our security posture in those areas. And when I think about, just to make sure that I'm being clear with folks here, when I think about supply chain risk management, and I'm thinking about how, from a procurement perspective, we buy things, we're not just thinking about buying goods, we also buy services. So we purchase energy, we purchase communications, we use financial services for payroll. Those are pretty important. Payroll's a fond topic for many people. So we are concerned about goods and services and the health of our critical infrastructure. And with this community here, the space critical infrastructure is a vital element to our economic prosperity and to our national security. So one final thing I want to talk about with regard to third-party risk is that when we think about doing business with organizations, this is a conversation we've also had in the government with our foreign partners, our allies, to talk about, when we think about sourcing, technology, and we look at third parties, we consider technical factors and non-technical factors. So technical factors should be self-evident. We want products that have been tested, we want products that are reliable, et cetera. But the non-technical factors, these are the types of things we think about when we characterize, what types of entities we want to do business with. So we know who we don't want to do business with, and those are where there's a fact pattern of, theft of intellectual property, bad behavior, law breaking, et cetera. But who do we want to do business with? What are the characteristics, the attributes of firms we want to do business with? And there are two attributes that I think top the list. One of those is transparency. Who makes the decisions in the company? Do we understand ultimate beneficial ownership so that we know who the decision makers are and what level of influence is there, and we can assuage any concerns we might have of an undue level of influence. The other of the top two issues is reliability or responsibility. And this is a situation where, when we think about responsible companies, these are firms where if a firm has suffered a cyber breach, how does that firm respond? You know, does the firm sit on the information for weeks on end as people try to rally to fix whatever happened, or does the company immediately notify shareholders and immediately make the public aware that an incident has occurred and the incident is being managed, and the firm then provides updates on how the incident is being managed? So those two things coming together are foundational for how we want to do engagement with reliable, trustworthy firms. And this is these two principles are principles that have been agreed upon by our colleagues in the EU, our foreign partners in many other different countries are just stepping up to embrace these and publicly make public assertions about these types of attributes. With that, I wanted to share a little anecdote about the space industry and thinking about risk in this environment, and then turn it back over to you, Chris, for Q&A. In the space industry, when we think about risk management, and you're thinking about if something happens, how do you respond to something? Do you just replace, something that is malfunctioning? That's always an option for many industries, but not exactly an option for a space-based asset. However, in the space industry, you have ground stations, and ground stations are constantly being upgraded and modernized and improved. Many years ago, I was approached by a government colleague from the Department of Commerce from NOAA, and they were looking at their weather satellites, and they're the ecosystem for the weather satellites. And they were looking to upgrade their ground stations. And the individual I was speaking to had said, was in the CIO community, had been talking to procurement professionals in the organization who were looking at procuring new equipment for the ground stations. And they had been faced by the perennial question of balancing cost, schedule, and performance. And the Chinese company Huawei had come to them and given them a really sweet deal from a pricing perspective. So NOAA was trying to figure out, do we go with the lowest price technically acceptable, or do we do something else? So they wanted to have a conversation with us in NCSC. So we had a good, healthy conversation, and they did not choose to go down that path. But it was very evident to me that when the government thinks about the federal systems, the ground stations for weather satellites don't process classified data. So the government's best security practices and policies that we use for classified systems and national security systems weren't applicable, they could serve as best practices, but there was no mandate, no requirement that NOAA follow, those practices in that environment. So we're now faced with situations where these other systems are pretty darn important, but they don't meet a definition that has been traditional. So we're now at a point where we're expanding our understanding of national security systems to other systems that might have equally grave consequences. So Chris, I'm happy to turn it over to you now. I just kind of gave a preface on the variety of issues that we look at, and to see what kinds of questions folks might have.
Well, that's fantastic, Joyce. Thank you. A lot to chew on there, and you're obviously on top of your game. So thank you very much. This is, as you noted, a burgeoning field in some ways, unfortunately, but we're glad you are there, and we are glad that you have the expertise that you do, because this is a new field in many respects. So well done. I would be remiss if I didn't ask what, if anything, you can say about the continuing investigation into SolarWinds Orion, at this stage? And are there any initial unclassified lessons to be learned that you could share? Or, you know, what can you tell our audience at this point about ongoing investigations and efforts to you know, clean out our networks from what apparently is a Russian strategic attack in many senses?
So certainly, so of course, you know, all federal government agencies, the products, you know, provided by this firm are fairly widely distributed. So numerous organizations or agencies and departments and agencies are looking at what may have transpired, and if they were, you know, vulnerable and from any of the actions taken. The Department of Homeland Security, CISA, will soon produce what they refer to as an insight product that will look at solar winds and will lay out some best practices for organizations to pursue if there's another software supply chain attack. CISA has been putting out numerous updates on SolarWinds, you know, talking about, you know, providing that information to the public, private sector, and to other government agencies. So that they are sort of the focal point for the government in sharing with the private sector what things the government has that can be broadcast. It is an ongoing examination, and will take some time to actually figure out, you know, how much, you know, have bad things happened, and if so, you know, what does the extent of the harm look like, and how do we protect ourselves from future events, future software supply chain compromises? On that, I would like to make folks aware that over the past couple of years, the Department of Commerce, NTIA, has actually been working on a standard for a software bill of materials. So they've been piloting this SBOM initiative with the healthcare sector, with the automotive industry, with the automotive ISAC, the Information Sharing Organization. And in the automotive industry, the suppliers to the automotive industry are actually driving the pilot in that case. And there's an effort that will soon be launched with the energy sector using energy, you know, security for industrial control systems as another pilot effort for the SBOM. So knowing what's in, when you do business with a third party, is this firm also using third-party software in what they're developing? So this is an important development and a way forward to have better insight with what you're getting in products that you buy, and ways to provide early warning for potential software supply chain vulnerabilities.
On that very topic, national security space systems are obviously increasingly reliant on sophisticated software as well as hardware. How can companies improve security associated with software development, and can enhanced software security go hand in hand with improved software reliability and functionality? How do those blend? How do companies balance those objectives?
So certainly, so from a software development perspective, I would point to the Department of Commerce NIST has the standards for software supply chain security that are pegged to the cybersecurity framework. So these are a host of controls that one can draw upon to improve your DevSecOps, your SecDevOps. Improve software development, improve testing, the testing environment, and improve, you know, how you the things that you attend to when you're managing your networks, because it is a dynamic environment where, you know, patches are being released, you know, updates are being released. So what you provision across a network on day one, you know, 2 years later is probably going to be, you know, somewhat different code base. So looking to the Department of Commerce, I would also point to what the Department of Defense has been doing with CMMC, you know, the capability maturity model requirements that they have put out. One of my defense colleagues shared with me yesterday that companies that had been using the CMMC requirements, this is anecdotal information, reported to the Department of Defense that they felt they were in a better position, with the SolarWinds compromise than they were pleased that they had moved forward with the CMMC requirements and thought that had been of utility to them to put that in place as a defensive measure.
That's great. That's helpful. You mentioned the notion of a team sport, and in particular, you briefly referenced the role of Congress. Describe for our audience how the Congress has played in this and the general approach that they bring to bear. My sense is, but obviously you're much closer to it than I am, that the Congress has been, if anything, pushing the various administrations, previous administrations, to take this more seriously. And so, can you talk a little bit about the role of Congress in this regard?
Certainly. So, as many of you know, cybersecurity issues cut across multiple different areas of congressional oversight. So there's no one oversight committee that looks at cyber.
It's 42 and counting or something like that.
Right. So certainly Homeland Security, the armed services committees, certainly the intelligence committees, the foreign affairs committees that are looking at trade issues. So there are a variety of elements in the Congress that have a sort of a piece of the action. So part of our challenges with Congress is educating folks so that the folks that we elect to represent us, have enough of a foundation to be able to make informed decisions and good policy decisions. There are elements in the Congress that want to take a very strong stance, and I'll point to an example in 2 years ago. In the National Defense Authorization Act, where there was a broad prohibition on any kind of federal spending with 5 Chinese companies that are in the telecommunications and video surveillance area. So Congress, there are elements of Congress, when Congress has had enough, that will put in legislation a prohibition, and that type of action tends to be a hammer, and not every situation warrants a hammer and a nail. The Congress passed the legislation that we needed in the Secure Technology Act to stand up, the Federal Acquisition Security Council, to then put in place sort of the rules and guidance for all agencies to have supply chain risk management programs. That was an important action where we had a gap in authorities, and Congress stepped in to fill that gap and gave government the flexibility to address the risk over time as the threat landscape evolved. So we do get flexibility from the Congress. We've also seen, and in this last National Defense Authorization Act for 2021, Congress identifying areas looking at the innovation ecosystem, and pointing to areas where there needs to be investment, greater investment in artificial intelligence, greater investment in microelectronics, semiconductors, printed circuit boards, greater investment in telecommunications, looking to 5G in the future. So that's from a bit of a sea change in Congress from the past, where you look to prohibitions and then flexible authorities, and now pointing to where there needs to be more investment to strengthen our industrial base.
Right. You mentioned the Federal Acquisition Security Council. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's been focusing on or is focusing on now, the decisions that it's rendered, et cetera? How would you grade the work so far, if you will, of the council?
So there aren't actual decisions that have been made yet, because from the rulemaking process, when the law was passed, there were specific actions in the statute that were the first steps that the government needed to take. One was to establish the actual council, the Federal Acquisition Security Council. Another one was to come up with a charter and with a strategic plan and submit those to the Congress. So the government did those things. We're now in the final throes of the rulemaking to publish the rules that agencies can then follow to begin implementing these programs. One of the things that's very important that we're in the middle of working on now, and industry can contribute to the dialogue here, is the authority that the Federal Acquisition Security Council has is to make recommendations on exclusion and removal orders. So the criteria that we develop to say when we're looking at sourcing from an entity, what factors come together to make us say, we need to look a little more closely at this entity and whether there's any adversarial influence here. So that's criteria, that's one threshold. And then the next threshold for a removal or exclusion order would be what factors come together that cause us to say this is an unmitigatable risk, therefore the FASC recommends exclusion or removal. And that criteria will be tested. Will be tested in the judicial process, as litigation is oftentimes how we learn the left and right boundaries of statutory authorities, and we build case law. So there has to be some transparency in the criteria. Industry needs to know the criteria that the government is using. So that is something that we're working on right now. And I anticipate that probably over the springtime of this calendar year, we'll be ready with the final rules, and we will begin moving out on some of our assessments and using the authorities that we have under that statute. So it's been a little bit of a slow process, which is the bureaucracy of rulemaking, which I don't know that anybody has a lot of control over, but that's sort of I think the schedule that we're on as a government.
Thank you. In August of last year, NCSC announced it had briefed various federal departments and agencies on supply chain threats posed by 5 Chinese companies in particular. Can you you mentioned this just a moment ago. Can you provide some additional detail for our audience on the companies and or the issues involved in that?
Sure. The specific companies were in Section 889 of the National Defense Authorization Act. So Congress identified Huawei, ZTE, Dahua, Hytera, and Hikvision as companies that are in the telecommunications and video surveillance environment. The statute was a broad prohibition on direct dealings with these companies, and then indirectly on restrictions or prohibitions where companies seeking to do business with the government, having the government as a client, if those companies had any of these prohibited firms in their business operations, they needed to make a determination to the government that they did or that they did not have this equipment, and then figure out were they going to move away from these firms. The intent from Congress was to wean the U.S. government and industry partners of the government away from these five firms. And there was a time that was put in place, a clock, so to speak, for agencies to become compliant with us, with this particular law. So last August was the law had been passed 2 years ago, and then last August was the 2-year deadline to become compliant with the law. There is a waiver authority for heads of agencies to pursue what I refer to as a 2-year grace period to become compliant with the law. So the briefing that we have been providing, the information we've been providing to other agencies was essentially current information on the risks posed by these particular suppliers. So we did that at the behest of the White House for all government agencies through a variety of venues like the Procurement Executive Council, the CIO Council, CISO Council, et cetera.
And has that material been made available to industry as well?
So some of we've shared some details. Some of these were classified briefings that we provided to government agencies, but we have spoken to companies about just general risk management principles and best practices.
Okay. In October of last year, the center unveiled new supply chain risk management guidance in a publication entitled "Exploitation of Supply Chains by Foreign Adversaries is a Growing Threat to America." That insightful report described emerging software supply chain threats that affect U.S. companies, including and especially U.S. defense industrial-based companies. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on the report's recommendations? I know you've touched on some of these, but are there other areas you'd like to reinforce for our audience today?
So just one, education and awareness is sort of the foundation of alerting people to the concerns posed, by third-party risk. One of the best practices that I always like to point out is that in an organization where it's government or private sector, there needs to be a governance process in place that provides top-down direction, for organizations. Maybe you maintain a risk register and have in place a periodicity of adjudicating, these risk issues and informing educated risk decisions. So both of these things together help build the capacity within an organization to make better informed risk decisions. So those, so the governance, it's a team sport, and it has to be driven top down. One of the challenges I see both in the government and the private sector in this team sport type of activity is that there really aren't incentives to bring these organizations together organically, these different lines of businesses. So the acquisition folks sometimes assume if they're buying something for the CIO or the network operators, that the network operators have already looked at a particular piece of gear and they know it works well and they've examined any kind of third-party risk. The people who are the network operators assume their contract professionals are, shaking the trees for information about a particular vendor. So that sometimes people assume away that somebody else has the issue covered. So, or at a organizational line level, people don't get rewarded for doing a job that is perceived to be someone else's job. So the acquisition people won't be rewarded for doing what is perceived to be the network operator's job, which is aligning incentives is part of what would be a governance process to bring a better enterprise look at risk. So that's one of the challenges that I would also surface.
That's great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between a compliance model, a compliance-focused model for cyber and supply chain security versus a more proactive model for assuring that national security space systems are secure from cyber and supply chain risk? What's the difference between the two, and which do you prefer and why?
So oftentimes, a compliance model becomes basically a checklist. And when something achieves the level of just being a checklist, it is easy. Human nature, will take you to saying, okay, I checked the box. I didn't have to rigorously examine everything. However, I would point to a best practice in compliance in the Department of Defense. When we look at the nuclear Navy, the nuclear Navy has a compliance as their foundation, but they know the risks. So they test and they exercise and they test and they exercise and they test and they exercise. So this notion of exercising is how they are really the gold standard for compliance. So there's the low level of compliance, which is a very mediocre effort, and then there's the gold star. So when I am asked questions about compliance, I like to give those two parameters there. Certainly, the constant testing and exercising has a cost associated with it. Mm-hmm. So when one is looking at managing costs, is that something that you want to invest in? Or are you going to trade? Is that just going to be a trade-off? So that's part of the enterprise risk decision. In the technology environment or in the supply chain environment, the threat landscape is constantly changing. So that behooves an organization to constantly be looking at risk, third-party risk. Just because you get into a contractual relationship on day one and you've looked at all risk on day one, you need to continuously monitor those relationships and that environment. So that continuous monitoring coupled with a level of compliance are two important parts of having a level of assurance that you're managing your risk appropriately.
Thank you. We have a question from an audience member. It reads as follows. Most of the threat data that is from a defense industrial based company, most of the threat data we receive from many intelligence community agencies is classified, but the companies that are being targeted are uncleared. What are your thoughts on getting one or two of the senior management officials from these space system suppliers cleared so we can discuss the threats and work with them to mitigate these threats?
So that's a good question. One of the things we have done in my organization with our director, Bill Evanina, is, and working with industry associations, is he has the authority to provide a one-time read-in to classified information. And we've done this with other sectors. We've done it with the energy sector, some of the financial services sector, some of the entities in the IT and comms sector. And it's been a fairly powerful thing where we have brought into our facility, a secured facility, a group of folks who have been identified as sort of the point person. We've provided a one-time read-in at the secret level, and then brought together a series of people in government organizations in the intelligence community to provide multiple perspectives on threat for that particular industry. So that's one thing that we have done to try to address this issue of more sharing this classified info more broadly. We have also have been in conversations with companies through different venues, talked about a safe harbor legislation. Folks have been looking at the legislation that for cybersecurity, the safe harbor for cybersecurity, and don't believe that that's comprehensive enough to include some of the supply chain information. So we're in the process of kind of thinking through, how do we, what are our options to expand that legislation appropriately to provide a safe harbor for better sharing two ways. It's not just the intelligence community sharing with industry, but what information does industry have to share with government, and be assured that that sharing doesn't result in any kind of punitive subsequent action from the government.
Thank you. You mentioned CMMC, or Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Do you have some comments on the regulation that was recently issued and or the broader CMMC, the value of the broader CMMC effort?
So that's not necessarily an issue I follow on a daily basis. So philosophically, the underpinning of CMMC was to raise the floor for the Department of Defense for companies. The Department of Defense clearly stating in multiple different venues, that security is an allowable cost, and providing through CMMC some of the security controls that would be expected from a contractual perspective from every vendor doing business with the department. And then the follow-on auditing to see that companies are compliant, because just self-attesting that security practices were in place was not deemed by the department to be sufficient to address security, as folks are so focused on cost, schedule, and performance. Security was going by the wayside and being neglected. So philosophically, CMMC is intended to raise the bar. And I would direct folks in this venue to speak to the Department of Defense, the acquisition folks, on getting a better sense of where the department is at and how effective that has been for the department.
Joyce, would you spend just a moment characterizing how the threat to both traditional national security space companies and some of the new entrants to the market has changed over time. What are you seeing as some of the key trends in the threats that these companies are facing and will likely face in the coming months?
Right. So one of the so the key threat is really to the software supply chain, or the uptick in actions has been for organizations or bad actors looking at the software supply chain. We looked at this in a report that our organization produced on economic espionage in cyberspace. We said that 2017 was really a watershed in software supply chain attacks. Back then there was NotPetya and a variety of other things, and I remember reading a remark from an individual from one of the commercial threat companies that produce reports like FireEye, CrowdStrike, Symantec, etc. An observation that software supply chains were so vulnerable because of poor security practices that it was easier to exploit the software supply chain than to find a zero-day exploit. So that's a pretty telling remark from these commercial threat companies. We have been in conversation with the Atlantic Council that produced a report last year called Breaking Trust, and they looked at a decade of data on software supply chain attacks. So I would point people to that report as a very compelling read. And if you need to speak to your colleagues to raise awareness, that's an important document that has the data behind the analysis is available to anybody that wants to look at it. So that's the software supply chain is one where I would say is where things have changed in the last 3 to 5 years.
Thank you. We have several questions that relate to information sharing between the government and the private sector. How would you characterize the state of that information sharing today? What needs to be done to expand it, or what are you all planning to do to expand that? And lastly, what can our association or other associations, think tanks, et cetera, do to try to help in that regard? I mean, we're happy to hold this event, but what can we do to follow up on that going forward?
So this is actually my first interaction with the space industry writ large. So I would encourage if there is I think there is a space ISAC, that venue be leveraged to raise awareness about supply chain issues. We can certainly follow up with that. Certainly to the extent feasible, have industry representatives participate in this notion of a one-time read-in for a group of security professionals. We are looking at how to provide information that might be derived from classified sources at the lowest level of classification, even if it's unclassified, to as broad as stakeholders as others. Congress passed the Secure Telecommunications Act, Secure and Resilient Telecommunications Act, which was focused on domestically the rural telecoms operators that have bought equipment from untrusted vendors to be able to help these rural providers who are financially in a difficult position to do basically a rip and replace of the untrusted equipment. Within that legislation, the Department of Commerce, NTIA, was directed to establish an information sharing partnership with that part of industry and to share information that had been declassified or unclassified information with that industry, the telecoms industry. So that's one of the things that we will build from that partnership and expand that appropriately to other sectors. And I would certainly view the space industry as a key strategic partner in that type of an activity.
Right. The U.S. Space Force, as you, I'm sure, are aware, the intelligence element of the U.S. Space Force was recently brought in as the 18th member of the U.S. intelligence community. How might the National Counterintelligence and Security Center work with the U.S. Space Force intelligence element to try to convey these messages as well, and be supportive of the work that the Space Force has underway as they go about organizing, training, and equipping the newest branch of our military?
Sure, certainly. So when we look at the intelligence community, my director has the authority to essentially evaluate the state of counterintelligence and security in those organizations. So that would be sort of a foundational thing where we would do an assessment of how capable they are in the disciplines of counterintelligence and security, and then advocate for what kinds of resources would be necessary to bootstrap them to successful mission execution. And that's resources for education, for workforce development, tools for testing, et cetera, the whole soup to nuts.
That sounds great. As you may know, there's discussion underway of establishing a National Space Intelligence Center as well, and having those connections, I think, would be very useful. In the limited time we have remaining, I wanted to ask you, where can audience members go for more information on these topics? Where would you point them, some of the best resources that they can access, whether it's on best practices or threat information or other? If you would like, in fact, please feel free to answer now, but if you'd like to share information with us as well, we'd be happy to forward it on to our member companies and others that are interested.
Okay, all right, thanks for bringing this up. So certainly you can go to our website in ODNI and CSC. We have a very large section on supply chain issues and links to other government organizations that do things in the supply chain environment. I would also point organizations to the Department of Commerce, NIST, for the standards and guidance and best practices from a cyber supply chain risk management perspective. So those would be kind of key areas. The Department of Homeland Security, CISA, is beginning to build some community of interest in the supply chain area. So I would point to those as a place to sort of find information that can lead you as an seeking for an educational perspective to go beyond just government regulations, which are kind of dry.
Right.
So we have best practices on our website. That's a great point of departure for folks.
Right, and I would add just one to your list. We recently had Ann Newberger as on a program here, and NSA is being more open these days about not only in warning about particular cyber threats and other. There's some useful information on the NSA website as well.
Yes, yes, there is.
It's a change from the old days, isn't it, Joyce?
It certainly is. It certainly is. Yes.
Well, we have just a moment or two left. Why don't I ask you for any summary remarks you'd like to make, any major points you'd like to reinforce at this point, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay, thank you. So I want to make sure folks understand that the threat landscape is evolving, and I hope that this particular event is just the beginning of an ongoing dialogue that we can continue to move forward. Maybe we can collaborate in producing white papers. I had the chance to look at some of the materials that have been produced by this association and published. Would welcome the opportunity to do those types of partnership types of activities with this particular community. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Well, we really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for sharing your valuable insights with us, and obviously keep up the fine work. Looking ahead, our next Spacetime interview is scheduled for next Friday, January the 22nd at 1 p.m. with Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten. I look forward to seeing you then. And again, make note that our normal operation is Tuesdays and Thursdays. The Hyten event is next Friday, January 22nd at 1 p.m. We usually start at 11, so note the different date and time. For more information on NSSA, the only association devoted solely to the National Security Space Enterprise, please visit our website, www.nssaspace.org. With that, thank you for your participation, Joyce, and our viewers as well. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks very much.